These weird history stories are dark and contain unbelievable moments that are strange but true. History is full of unexpected endings and sometimes even unexplained mysteries, as these real events show. March of 1942 was a dark time period in history. German saboteurs in Australia were poised to destroy critical infrastructure and smooth the way for an invasion. The Axis plot was thwarted and newspapers were ready to publish the story. The day before the historic event went public, a criminal named Sidney Gordon Ross contacted ministers in New Zealand with his own similar spy story. He said he had been approached by the Germans with the request to spy on his own country of New Zealand. His criminal history as a safe-breaker had attracted their attention, but as a loyal patriot, he instead went to the New Zealand government and volunteered to become a double agent. He was recruited by Major Kenneth Folks of the New Zealand Security Intelligence Bureau, or SIB for short. There, Sidney Ross went under the alias of Captain Calder and began to report some weird and scary facts about what the Axis were up to. Folks had been wrong about plenty of spy plots in the past, but with Sidney and other top agents supplying information, he was quickly making quite a name for himself. In July of 1942, he learned of a new plot to kidnap political officials, including the Prime Minister himself, and of more sensitive infrastructure targeted for destruction. As history goes, Folks insisted this story was true, and he asked for martial law to be declared, and for the SIB to be given the power to detain suspects without trial. Despite the legendary plots he had already uncovered, the Prime Minister held back on granting the request. Soon the true events would be made clear. Sidney Ross was not a spy or a counter-spy, or even a basic informant. He was a simple grifter looking to scam his way into an easy life. In order to conduct his undercover mission as Captain Calder, Sidney had received large sums of money, a car, and a luxury hotel, and simply made up false information in return. A man named Charles Alfred Rimmers was the mastermind behind the plot to defraud the SIB. He had been serving time for burglary in prison when he first met Sidney. When he later passed away from leukemia, Sidney thought the idea could still work and decided to continue. But here's where the story gets really weird. Whenever Sidney would tell Major Folks a false story, the Major would add his own even dramatic details to make the SIB look even more heroic. At one point, he claimed to have troops ready to repel invasion waves that later were proven to simply not exist. The organization was disbanded when its true history of fabricating false intelligence was discovered. Disgraced, Folks returned to England where he spent the rest of his life in obscurity. Sidney, after one last attempt to convince the police that his story was real, eventually confessed to the true version of events, but he never served time for the lies that nearly brought New Zealand under full martial law. At the age of 15, Isabella Tomasi, born of nobility, joined a convent in Sicily, where she became known as Sister Maria. Here, the darkest moments of her life would later make for some truly weird history stories. Why she began screaming and fainting at the altar remains unexplained to this day. She claimed that the devil was trying to possess her, a story that would seemingly come true on August 11, 1676. This is a paranormal mystery that centuries later has only recently been somewhat solved. That morning, the sisters found Maria on the floor in a trance. She had missed choir and was surrounded by letters and covered with ink. The mysterious letters had been written by her but in a language unknown, and in a strange handwriting unlike hers. In her disturbing version of history, Sister Maria said that her hand was truly guided by a great number of evil spirits who were sent by the devil. Over the next 3 centuries, various history groups have tried to decipher the mysterious letter, and it wasn't until 2017 that the unexplained mystery was partially solved. Using decryption software from the dark web, researchers from the Ludum Science Center in Sicily translated roughly 70% of the soul letter that had survived throughout history. They found the letter had been written in a weird combination of foreign languages, including ancient Greek, Arabic, Latin, and even strange runes that were found to form a disturbing backstory. Humans are responsible for the creation of God, reads the mysterious letter. This system works for no one. God thinks he can free mortals. It's been suggested that Maria, who was very well read, was suffering from some kind of delirious episode that allowed her to pen these infamous words. Baffled experts continue to puzzle over whether this dark historical event is true, or simply the product of a disturbed mind. For whatever caused Sister Maria to write the letters truly terrified her, and has since made for one of the darkest moments ever known. What the other letters could have contained remains one of history's greatest unexplained mysteries of the world, and if her visions were true, then it's perhaps one that's best left unknown. In September of 1802, 17 boxes of ancient Greek treasure were placed on a royal ship known as the HMS Mentor. On account of a fierce storm, the ship only made it as far as Cape Aviamones, where it was unable to anchor in time and hit the rocks. The crew abandoned ship and survived, but the Mentor sank to the bottom of the sea along with its precious cargo. The ancient treasure that had been lost was the Parthenon Marbles, a collection of 5th century Greek sculptures recovered from the Temple of Athena. The treasure was being transported in the name of Lord Elgin, ambassador of the Ottoman Empire, who had obtained half of the sculptures with the permission of the occupying Turks. Under his watch, the sculptures were successfully recovered from the waters and brought back to Britain, but this was far from the end. The relics would become the center of a weird history dispute between two countries that has never been solved. The Ottoman Empire would become Greece after being freshly liberated by Russia in 1832, roughly 30 years after the Parthenon Marbles were taken to Britain. No longer under Turkish control, the Greeks rejected British ownership and wanted the Parthenon Marbles returned. Britain disagreed. The two history stories presented by each country are vastly different. In the British version, Ambassador Elgin had successfully preserved the statues because they were being kept in a state of disrepair by the Ottoman Empire, and were even ground down into mortar. The sculptures had been given to the ambassador as part of a deal for keeping the Egyptians from invading, though this has not been confirmed. Greece countered by saying, if anything, the statues were further damaged by the sinking of the Mentor ship, and should have never been taken. Centuries later, the unsolved case of ownership continues to draw media attention. Some of the surviving sculptures can be found on display in Greece, and others in Britain. As of the making of this top 5 list, the two countries had recently announced another series of discussions would soon commence, with no official agreement reached as to who owns the full collection. As a side note, the Mentor shipwreck has since become a historical treasure trove of its own. In recent years, divers have uncovered gold, silver, and other ancient treasures from Greek archaeological sites. Also found were various compasses, bullets, and glassware throughout history, making the ship a figurative time capsule of the 17th century archaeology. But ownership of the real prize, the Parthenon Marbles, remains a weird history story that has no ending in sight. The USS William D Porter was a well-equipped destroyer ship that began its first top-secret mission on November 12, 1942, escorting a ship named the USS Iowa to North Africa. What was inside, no one knew at the time. As with most weird history stories, the naval escort mission did not go well. The night before, the Porter backed into the side of another ship and caused significant damage with the anchor. The next day, they met with the USS Iowa and discovered the quote-unquote cargo on board was none other than President Roosevelt himself. Shortly afterwards, there was a huge underwater explosion that caused the ships to scatter their information, thinking it was a submarine attack. In reality, a depth charge had accidentally rolled off of the Porter's deck and had caused a huge underwater explosion. They tried to regroup, but the Porter soon fell far behind, only to be further delayed when it was struck by a large wave, The boiler room flooded as a result, and one sailor was lost at sea. These unbelievable moments were not nearly as embarrassing as when President Roosevelt asked to see the destroyers in action. As the Iowa successfully took out most of their targets, which were large balloons, the Porter decided to likewise fire at some of the targets floating closer to them. The friendly competition between two ships went wrong when it came time to fire practice torpedoes. The Porter accidentally launched a live one straight at the Iowa. The Porter frantically flashed lights to signal their error, and when that didn't work, they radioed the Iowa to let them know that they had just fired a torpedo at the president. Much to everyone's dismay, when Roosevelt found out, he asked to be brought closer to the railings so that he could better watch. As history goes, Iowa managed to take evasive action, and the torpedo harmlessly hit a wave. Thankfully, there was no more drama and the ships made it to North Africa. But now you know of the time that the president was almost torpedoed in what could have been one of the darkest moments in history. The Porter spent the rest of her short career in the Pacific Ocean and sank on March 24, 1945, when an enemy plane hit the water alongside her and tore a hole in the hull. Miraculously, everyone aboard managed to escape alive on that occasion. From 2013 to 2017, in what would later become one of the world's greatest mysteries, the remains of 49 bodies were discovered in the Arctic Circle near a Russian town. Puzzled archaeological experts have traced the origins of the site back to medieval times, but what's especially strange and mysterious is how a handful of bodies had been perfectly mummified throughout history. Archaeologists were initially shocked at this amazing and seemingly impossible discovery. Some of the smaller bodies were covered in copper, which, when combined with the cool temperatures of the Siberian soil, naturally shielded the remains from oxygen and greatly slowed the rate of organic decay, creating a naturally occurring mummification process. With this bizarre mystery explained, historians pondered over a second unsolved mystery. Many of the artifacts found at the burial site had originated much further south, hinting that an unexplained historic event had caused some kind of migratory shift in medieval Siberia. For example, among the ancient artifacts discovered in the Siberian permafrost were bronze bowls which had come all the way from Persia. It was only after careful excavation and further scientific testing that some answers about the dig site were uncovered. But at the same time, other unbelievable discoveries only seemed to widen the mystery. The remains were revealed to share DNA traits not only with the people of Siberia, but also with those of Korea and Japan. These DNA results have led historians to conclude that this site was most likely a historic gathering for a unique group of people, previously unknown to history, who had a unique mixture of early Siberian ancestry. The bowl artifacts from Persia lend further credibility to a popular explanation that this small anonymous region of northern Russia was once an ancient trading hub of sorts, or at least a meeting place of different historic cultures. If it wasn't for the accidental mummification of 5 bodies due to a rare chemical reaction between copper and soil, then this weird history story would likely have been completely erased by centuries of forgotten time. For much of Britain, the Blitz was the darkest historical event in recent history. In Liverpool, it also uncovered another dark history story that had gone unnoticed for decades. It was 1945 when 3 boys playing with a metal cylinder on a demolished site made a dark discovery. The cylinder was a little over 6 feet in length and 20 inches in diameter. It had been rolled into the area a few weeks earlier by some other children playing, and it had been used as a bench by others. One end was sealed with a metal disc, but the other had been crushed. One of the boys managed to break open the cylinder and found a shoe. The shoe was attached to a human foot. Police were called and began the investigation into what would be dubbed the body in the cylinder. At first, it was thought that this was an unfortunate man who had perished during the Blitz a few years earlier. The cylinder had been removed from a demolished site by American soldiers, clearing a site on Boundary Street East in 1941. Investigators thought the victim must have sought shelter in the pipe, which was then sealed during the attack. It was soon discovered this man had passed away long before this dark event. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, and a postcard found on him dated to 1885. 2 diaries from the 1880s were also discovered, though they were mostly unreadable. It seemed clear this man had been in the cylinder since the 1880s and had gone unnoticed for nearly 60 years. The most valuable clue to the man's identity was a railway advice note from June of 1885. It had been written on a billhead from a paint and varnish company called T.C. Williams & Co. The name of the company gave investigators trying to solve this dark mystery something to work with. They discovered that T.C. Williams referred to Thomas Cregan Williams. Williams had declared bankruptcy in March of 1884 and had disappeared from the historical record in 1885. At the time, it wasn't uncommon for people who wanted to start a new life to work aboard ships to pay their way for passage to America. As Williams had a lot of people who he owed money to, it would make sense that he tried to escape his old life. But now investigators thought something much darker had happened to the man. The cylinder had no traces of paint residue on it. It wasn't part of a machine, and it wasn't an industrial accident that had taken the man's life. Investigators theorized it had been a ventilation tube at the paint factory, which Williams had crawled into to sleep as he was trying to hide from his creditors. The fumes had likely taken his life, and for some reason he hadn't been discovered. However, the coroner couldn't be certain this was the actual Thomas Williams, or that this theory was correct. A darker theory suggested that Williams had faked his own passing with the body and fled to America, not realizing he'd hidden the body somewhere that nobody would look. No family members of Williams were found at the time of the inquest, and the dark history case officially remains unsolved. In 1991, divers exploring a site off the coast of New Jersey discovered a strange, unexplained wreckage 60 miles out to sea. The wreckage was nicknamed the U-Hoo, and discovering its dark history was a costly mission. The wreckage was first discovered by a fisherman via sonar. It was at a depth of 240 feet and would need extremely skilled divers to go and explore it. This was much deeper than amateur divers could go. In September of 1991, a group of deep wreck divers began to explore the wreck. It looked extremely unfamiliar to them. It wasn't anything like what they'd been expecting, but shining a light over the strange angles and a hatch revealed a torpedo. It was a submarine, and it wasn't long before the crew determined it was a German U-boat from the Second World War. During this dark history period, German U-boats would patrol the US East Coast and sink merchant ships on their way to take supplies to Europe. Many of these boats were destroyed by the US military. There were 2 sites relatively close to where the U-boat was found. One was 150 miles north and east of this site, and one was 110 miles south. But it was deemed virtually impossible for either of those boats to be the mysterious U-Hoo. Researchers went through the archives of this dark history period to try to find the identity of the mysterious submarine, but there was no record of any sinkings that could explain the boat. Finding the true history story of this mystery would require divers to head to the boat again. The dive team completed numerous dives to the boat. It was extremely dangerous, and 3 people lost their lives while exploring the wreck, but the quest to find the truth continued. The first piece of evidence that pointed to the identity of the submarine was a small dining utensil. In the handle was carved the name Horenberg. Going through the archives, Horenberg was identified as Martin Horenberg, who worked in the radio room of the U-869. There was only one problem with this. The U-869 sank off the coast of Gibraltar. The U-869 had been patrolling the coast of the US in 1945, but received orders to go to Morocco. There, on February 28th, American and French ships reported the sinking of a U-boat. There was no physical evidence of the wreckage, but when America discovered that the U-869 had been lost, it was assumed that this was the ship that was sunk near Gibraltar. The divers uncovered more artifacts, including schematics and an escape log. Then, in August of 1997, John Chatterton received a small wooden box from the sub's motor room. It was incredibly dangerous to reach and required taking off the oxygen tank, but John managed to get in and out without any trouble. On the box was a small tag, which clearly identified the boat as the U-869. Either the boat hadn't received the orders to go ahead to Africa, or it ignored them and stayed put. How it was sunk remains a mystery. One suggestion is that it was hit by one of its own torpedoes, which unfortunately wasn't unheard of for submarines at the time. Another suggestion is that it was sunk by Allied forces, but for some reason the wreck wasn't recorded. The Connecticut shoebox case is one of the oldest cases in America. The true crime story dates back to 1886. No clues that could solve this historical mystery have ever been uncovered. The crime was uncovered in August of 1886. A group of local residents were walking along wooded farmland just outside of Wallingford, Connecticut. One of them had his dog with him. The dog started acting strangely as they came across a wooden box that looked as if it had fallen off a cart. The lettering on the outside of the box stated that it had once contained a dozen pairs of men's shoes, but that wasn't what was discovered when the men pried the box open. Instead, they made a disturbing discovery of a human torso. It was a male torso wrapped in tar paper and straw. The limbs and head were all missing. There were no identifying marks on the man's torso, or any clues as to his identity. A medical examiner investigating the case claimed the man was between 30 and 40 years old, and had passed away 5 to 10 days earlier. A large amount of arsenic was found in his stomach, and it was determined that the cause for his passing was poisoning. The arms and legs of the victim were found in September, not far from where the torso was discovered. The head was never uncovered. There were many theories about who this man was and what had caused his untimely demise. One theory was that the man was Arthur Cooley, a local man who had recently gone missing. He had disappeared shortly after retiring and collecting his pension. Cooley had a history of drinking and gambling, and it seemed possible that had led him to running into trouble. But Cooley was found alive a few days after the shoebox case was found. Other theories were that the man was responsible for a series of fires, and he'd been taken out to keep the identities of his accomplices a secret, or that he was possibly responsible for the Haymarket riots. The box was traced to a factory in Massachusetts, which had sent the box to a dealer in Chicago, who sent it to a local retailer. The retailer had left the box in his yard for a few months before he sold it to a man who then disappeared a few weeks before the gruesome discovery was made. No answers to this dark history mystery were ever uncovered, and it officially remains a cold case that will likely never be solved. It's often said that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about our own oceans. There are things lurking beneath the sea that remain hidden from science and are still unexplained. One of these things made itself known to the US Navy in a scary history story. The event took place in 1978. The exact location is unknown, but in one source from 1980, the incident is said to have taken place near the equator, in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of South America. The USS Stein was on a routine patrol when the radar system used to identify submarines suddenly malfunctioned. The men aboard the ship were getting no readings. While there were no known threats in the Stein area, being at sea with no way of detecting submarines was not something anybody wanted to risk. The ship made its way back to a dry dock, where the cause for the problem was quickly discovered. The coating on the outside of the sonar dome had been completely shredded. Large tears covered 8% of its surface, and it looked like a swarm of alligators had decided to attack the sonar. Each tear had a tooth or claw at the bottom of it. A Navy biologist was brought in to try to find an answer to this strange mystery. He concluded that the claws left behind were responsible for the tears, and they seemed to come from a giant squid. The only problem with this conclusion is that the squid would have to be half the size of the Statue of Liberty to cause such huge tears. Today, researchers believe this was an attack by a colossal squid. Colossal squids can be up to 46 feet in length. While this would still be smaller than the creature the Navy biologist assumed was responsible for the damage, the different proportions between a giant squid and a colossal squid could explain the difference. Colossal squids are some of the most mysterious creatures in our oceans. Some of the largest specimens have only been uncovered after their beaks were found in the stomachs of whales, so it's possible even larger ones exist. The only issue with the colossal squid solution to this strange history mystery is the fact that the squids normally live in the Southern Ocean surrounding Antarctica. If the Stein was in equatorial waters, the squid would have been a long way from home. Whatever the exact cause of the mysterious incident, it's certain that there is more beneath the sea than we currently understand. The disappearance of the Flying Tiger Flight 739 is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries from the Vietnam War. Taking place in 1962, the dark history mystery claimed the lives of 107 people and has never been explained. Flying Tiger Flight 739 was a Lockheed Super Constellation plane traveling from California to Saigon in South Vietnam. Normally, Flying Tiger flights carried cargo rather than people, but this one had been specially chartered by the US Navy. The only cargo that was carried were the luggage belonging to the people on board. The plane was carrying 93 US soldiers, 3 South Vietnamese soldiers, and a crew of 11 people. The US soldiers were mostly communication specialists with experience in the jungle. Sources differ as to whether they were on a secret mission or simply heading to Vietnam to train South Vietnamese troops. The flight left Travis Air Force Base at 5:45 on March 14, 1962. On its way, it was scheduled to stop in Honolulu, Wake Island Airfield, Guam, and Clark Air Base in the Philippines. The first 3 stops took place without issue. In Hawaii and on Wake Island, there were some maintenance works, but it was primarily refueling that took place. In Guam, the plane was refueled again. It took off at 12:57 on March 15th. The Philippines were a little over 6 hours away, and the plane had enough fuel for 9 hours and 30 minutes. But an unexplained mystery happened somewhere over the Pacific, and the plane never reached the Philippines. Between 1325 and 1422, Flight 739 made 4 messages to Guam International Flight Service. They were regular messages requesting permission to climb to 18,000 feet and reporting their progress. They were all normal messages, and air traffic control had no reason to believe they wouldn't radio in at 15:30 for their regular update. The 15:30 message never came. While talking to another flight, Guam International Flight Service Station received heavy radio static around that time, but no messages from Flight 739 came through. Repeated attempts to contact the plane were made, but nothing was received. Search teams were sent to get to the bottom of this mystery, but no evidence was ever found to explain what had happened. An oil tanker sailing in the Pacific reported seeing an intensely bright explosion at about 15:30 in an area which would have been close to where Flight 739 was supposed to be. But no oil slick or debris was ever found. An investigation into the disappearance of Flight 739 has turned up no answers. One explanation for this dark history mystery is sabotage. In Honolulu and Guam, the area where the plane was parked could be accessed by anybody, and it would have been possible for something to be slipped on board. But without any debris or the wreck itself, it's only possible to speculate about the cause for this dark history story. One of the most well-known sculptures of the ancient Egyptian arts are the many creations of the human-lion hybrid Sphinx. These statues have been uncovered time and time again throughout Egypt, dating back many decades. A more recent discovery was unearthed by a team of archaeologists belonging to the Hebrew University. The puzzling discovery was that of the paws of a 4,000-year-old Sphinx artifact still attached to its base. Between the paws of the statue a hieroglyphic clue was etched and translated. The symbolic clue was the name Menkaura. The inscription also dated the statue to the 3rd millennium BC, somewhere in the middle of the Bronze Age. What happened to be so confusing about this find is that the artifact was uncovered in Israel, 892 kilometers from Giza, where King Menkaura ruled over the 4th dynasty and oversaw the construction of all 3 Giza pyramids, which is a more likely place to find such an uncommon artifact. According to the research conducted, Egypt had no immediate connection to Israel during this time. The remnant was unveiled in an archaeological surface, which dated back to the Hazar Desolation, situated at the city palace entrance. It was also later revealed by a team member of the Hebrew University archaeologists that this particular artifact was the only known sphinx in existence pertaining to King Menkaura, making it an even more unique and important find. Additionally, the symbols quoted, "beloved by the divine manifestation that gave him eternal life," had led one researcher to believe that the statue possibly emerged in Heliopolis, a major city of ancient Egypt. This unique piece of art somehow found itself all the way in Hazar, Israel, quite the distance from its supposed origin, baffling the archaeological and scientific world. The search for the rest of the Sphinx continues, with the claim made by the team that the search will not end until the remaining piece or pieces are found. One can only theorize how the remnants of the Sphinx of Menora came to settle in Israel. Chakur was the name belonging to a steamship built in 1982 by the Detroit Dry Dock Company. The ship's purpose was to transport people and cargo between Wisconsin and southern Michigan for the Graham and Morton Transportation Company, who owned the ship. The SS Chakur was specifically designed to navigate itself through the winter hurdles. The ship was built with a stout wooden hull, strengthened with iron and reinforced with iron plates on the bottom to break through the thickened ice in its path. However, despite the intentional, strong design, Chakur wasn't used in a winter run until 1893 or 1894. Later, the ship was routed on a new course originating past St. Joseph, predestined for Milwaukee, until it was placed back on the previous Chicago route. Chakur was later stationed, which was due to a low point in ships needed. In 1895, Chakur was to be prepared for dispatch to receive a cargo of flour from Milwaukee to Benton Harbor. The ship set off on January 20th, 1895, and arrived in Milwaukee the same day before leaving Milwaukee again not long after. At the same time, President Graham, the owner of the SS Chakur and president of the Graham and Morton Transportation Company, sent an employee to the Benton Harbor after uncovering that a heavy storm was underway, where another one of his ships was laying over at the dock. He also had to get word to the captain of the Chakur through a telegram message, which became quite the mission and unfortunately reached the captain too late. The Chakur already made her way onto Lake Michigan. The calls of the messenger could not be heard from the distance. Destined to arrive on January 21st, the ship never made land with St. Joseph. Many search parties were arranged, lasting well into the nights, but the ship was nowhere to be found. Within the following months, only small remnants of the ship washed ashore. Nonetheless, the entirety of the ship nor crew were ever found, and was last seen entering Lake Michigan. Letters and bottles also made their way to shore, but it was never confirmed if they were hoaxes. The SS Chakur's disappearance remains a mystery. Lake Michigan has had thorough searches directed by MRSA, with SS Chakur at the top of the list. In 1996, a curious formation was discovered near the town of Delinga in Shanghai, in China. The discovery was made by Bei Yu, who was scouting through an isolated area of the Chaidam Basin. He came across a triangular cave in Mount Beigong near a saltwater body. Inside the triangular-shaped cave, Bei Yu had stumbled upon a curious assemblage of what resembled metal piping. The pipes rose from the ground and lodged themselves in the walls. The pipes even projected from the top of the slope and ran along the shoreline of the Tasan Lake, 260 feet away. The pipes are unvarying in size and look to be intentionally positioned in a specific form. Bei Yu, who was said to be an archaeologist, had taken samples of the rusty pipes and sent them through to a government laboratory to be tested. The results came back as 92% of the frequent minerals, such as ferric oxide, calcium oxide and silicon dioxide. However, the remaining 8% was an unidentified compound and could not be determined by those who were studying it. Later, thermoluminescent tests had been conducted in 2001, which revealed that the pipes dated back long before human occupancy of that location. Along with this, the pipes were rooted so deep that scientists ruled out that they were handled by standard modernized humans. It was theorized, after a similar phenomenon was found in Louisiana, that these pipes had been the result of fossilized tree roots. This explanation, however, didn't convince all of the investigators or anyone following the research. Another theory was proposed that the pipes were the form of a casting. The hypothesis detailed that crevices were left behind by the Tibetan Plateau, which later became topped with iron deposits after flooding in the location. The obscurity and origin of the Beang Pipes still harbors many theories, but the exact explanation of the mysterious pipes still remains unknown. The submarine COV was originally proposed to be one of a boat triad, with the pennant number NN3, but the other two boats were never assembled, and the submarine ended up as an experimental cruiser, harboring a few technical faults. COV had been the largest submarine of its time in the later Japanese productions. The submarine was intended to track surface ships, and had also been equipped with a float plane. Even though the underwater craft had provided many defenses, it showed many issues early on in its deployment, including technical issues, and was reported to exhibit bizarre behavior. In 1935, COV had been positioned in Brest, the French submarine base, where the submarine had immediate access to the Atlantic Ocean and Mediterranean. The COV periodically performed surface duties for 4 years in the area. In June of 1940, COV was navigated to the British naval base. In that same year, in November, the submarine made its way to the north, stopping at the Royal Navy base. COV spent almost 2 weeks in training, but was still unfit to perform its original duty. After many more journeys and repairs, the submarine found itself unescorted in transit to Tahiti, February 12, 1942, with only one working propeller and traveling at 10 knots. The submarine never reached the intended destination. COV, one of the largest submarines of its time, was never seen again after its last departure. No distress signals have been noted, and no sightings have been uncovered since. Even with the float plane equipped, COV remained lost. A report was made of a collision by the Thomson Likes, claiming to have come into contact with the submarine. However, the damage was inconsistent with the immensity of the ship. The area of the report was deemed too vast to be able to thoroughly search, therefore it was never proven. The disappearance of submarine COV remains unclear, and the whereabouts of the ship and its crew are still unknown. The Kryptos sculpture resides in the courtyard of the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters. The sculpture was erected in 1990 by Sanborn, consisting of petrified wood, a copper screen, and a partially solved inscription, providing the agency with a mysterious challenge. Only 3 of the 4 inscriptions have been interpreted. Almost 3 decades later, the last portion awaits its decoding. The sculpture has twice provided clues to the community of codecrackers. Each of the sections follow the same concept of secrecy and discovery, each one being more challenging than the previous. To make things even more difficult, Sanborn intentionally misspelled a word at the end of the first passage, which read, quote, "Between subtle shading of light lies the nuance of occlusion, with occlusion being spelled with a Q." The next passage detailed the location of the headquarters by longitude and latitude, along with the question, does Langley know about this? They should. It's buried out there somewhere. X who knows the exact location, only WW. WW referred to William Webster, the head of the CIA at the time the model was revealed, who Sanborn left with a clue to solve the passages. However, Webster declined an interview. The third installment referenced Egyptologist Howard Carter's statement made at the opening of the tomb belonging to King Tut. The final passage was inscribed containing only 97 characters, which was less than the previous paragraphs, yet it remains unsolved. The 2 pointers given by Sanborn for the last section were the words Berlin from the 64th to 69th characters of the paragraph in 2010, and clock starting at the 70th character of the paragraph to the 74th revealed in 2014. Another chance has been given by Sanborn. At the age of 74, the word Northeast positioning at characters 26 to 34 of the final installment. The last passage of the 11-foot-tall Kryptos remains unknown. Sanborn made the decision that if the cipher remains unsolved before he parted the world, the solution to the cipher will be put up for auction for one new owner to keep hold of the secret, and possibly release new clues until the Kryptos is finally deciphered. Thomas Jackson, better known as Stonewall Jackson, got his nickname while fighting at the Battle of Bull Run in Virginia during the American Civil War, when Confederate General Bernard E. Bee was heard yelling at his troops, "There's Jackson standing like a stone wall," but also because the men who served under him were in awe of his courageous and stubborn nature during battle. He also became known as one of the Civil War's most skillful tacticians, but his life would come to a tragic end when he was accidentally fired upon by his own troops on the 2nd of May, 1863, during the Battle of Chancellorsville. He didn't perish on the battlefield, but passed away soon after when the pneumonia hemorrhagic shock set in as a result of the wounds that he sustained during the unfortunate accident. It's considered by many historians to be the turning point of the war. Many people are baffled as to how his own troops could have misidentified him for one of the enemy's soldiers, since this seems quite negligent. But a team of researchers believes they may have finally found the answer to this mystery, and as it turns out, it has a lot to do with the position of the moon on that particular night. The troops under Jackson's command had just celebrated a victory against the 12th Corps, but they had very little time to rest as he ordered his men to keep fighting well after the sun had set that very same day. Visibility would have been very low, with just the light of the moon to light their way, but they battled on regardless, something that wasn't usually done at this time. This is when confusion started to set in, and unbeknownst to Jackson, his fate was sealed. At this point, a Confederate soldier who was riding on the left flank of the 18th North Carolina Regiment mistakenly thought that Jackson and his men were the enemy and that they were about to be attacked. Major John Barry then gave the order to fire at the advancing troops, and Jackson was hit in the wrist as well as his left arm, which in modern times would have been dealt with swiftly, but this was not the case during the times of the American Civil War. The injuries were considered too severe to be successfully treated, and Jackson's arm had to be amputated. Unfortunately, he suffered complications shortly afterward and contracted pneumonia, which ultimately ended his life just over a week later. Barry, the commander who gave the order to fire upon Jackson and his men, would later speak of the guilt that he felt over the incident. But given the hectic and chaotic nature of the confrontations of the Civil War, many other leaders would have ended up doing the exact same thing, since there was a large element of uncertainty involved, and a decision had to be made in a matter of seconds. To solve this mystery once and for all, Don Olson, an astronomer at Texas State University, and Laurie E. Jasinski, a researcher from the Texas State Historical Association, had to figure out exactly where Jackson and Barry were positioned at around 9 p.m., the moment that the decision was made to fire. They made use of Confederate almanacs, battle maps that were created by military historian Robert Crick, as well as the compass direction of the moon and the lunar phase at that exact time during the battle, and found that the mistake wasn't as unavoidable as some people may think. They discovered that from Barry's perspective, Jackson and his men would have been nothing more than a set of dark silhouettes, making it impossible for them to see any details that would have helped them identify their fellow soldiers. In the heat of the battle, virtually every decision would have had a profound effect on the men under an officer's command, and if that decision isn't made quickly, it could spell disaster and likely cause many lives to be needlessly lost. And so Barry had to decide what the right course of action would be in the situation that he and his men found themselves in. Unfortunately, it was the wrong decision at that moment, but under different circumstances, he may have saved many lives if the advancing regiment had been a group of enemy soldiers instead. Barry and his men would have been remembered ever since as the troop that fired on and ended the life of Stonewall Jackson. But at least now their reputations have been restored somewhat, since many other officers would have given the exact same orders if they were placed in Barry's position. In fact, some historians argue that if he hadn't given the order to fire, it would have been seen as even more negligent. If the approaching silhouettes had actually been enemy soldiers, and the decision to fire wasn't made, many more soldiers would not have lived to see the sunrise the following morning. There's also something to be said about Jackson's decision to keep his men fighting long into the night, when he knew that visibility would be very poor, and the likelihood of a mistake being made would have been much higher than a normal battle during the day. This isn't to say that Jackson's demise was of his own doing, but it is undeniable that if he had chosen to rather fight on the following morning, he may have lived on to see many more battles during the Civil War. Olson had finally solved the puzzle of Jackson's passing, but this isn't the only time that he's unraveled historical mysteries with the use of astronomy. He also discovered that Paul Revere was able to complete his famous ride on the 18th of April, 1775. Some historians were baffled by the fact he wasn't spotted by British soldiers, who were stationed on a ship close to an area where he passed by. And again, it was found to be thanks to the position of the moon. There's still one question that bothers many scholars, but unfortunately we'll never know whether the Battle of Gettysburg would have turned out any differently if Jackson had not been wounded, or if he hadn't succumbed to his injuries. One of the most famous volcanic eruptions in history is that of Mount Vesuvius, which is located in Italy, and erupted at around 1 p.m. on an October afternoon in 79 AD. It brought about a massive amount of destruction, and is thought to have ended the lives of as many as 16,000 people in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other towns that were close to the volcano to be affected. Most of us are familiar with the strange sight left behind by the blast, the petrified remains of people who lived in Pompeii and who succumbed to the massive amount of ash that was spewed into the air, covering the surrounding area in 19 feet of ash and burying the site for the next few centuries. But not many people are aware that other strange treasures were unearthed when Herculaneum, a town located about 11 miles from Pompeii, was discovered in 1709, quite by accident, when farmers attempted to build a well and found the town buried under their feet. When excavation was then started, archaeologists came across a villa that's thought to have belonged to Julius Caesar's father-in-law, and along with it, they started finding strange lumps of coal that were then thrown away. But they soon realized that these lumps were far more important than they initially thought, when one of the workers at the site noticed that they contained what looked like writing, and instead of getting rid of them, they decided to save them. It was then found that these lumps of coal were in fact papyrus scrolls that had been preserved thanks to carbonization caused by the high temperatures of the volcanic flow and the low oxygen levels below the volcanic ash. Next came the daunting task of unrolling the incredibly fragile scrolls that hadn't been disposed of without damaging them. One man named Antonio Piaggio, who served as the manuscript curator of the Vatican, came up with an ingenious contraption that slowly unwrapped the scrolls at an incredibly slow pace. So slow, in fact, that the first scroll was only fully unwrapped 4 years later. 6 of these scrolls were gifted to Napoleon by King Ferdinand IV, and he in turn handed them over to the Institut de France. In modern times, scientists have struggled to find a way to read the scrolls without damaging them beyond repair. There was some success in 2002, when a professor from the University of Kentucky devised a method by which ancient scrolls could be read with the use of modern technology. The first step was to take a 3D scan of the scroll, after which each individual layer was identified. These layers or pages can then be flattened out virtually, and any leftover remnants of ink can then be identified and properly analyzed. This technique was used on the scrolls found at Herculaneum, and it was uncovered that traces of ink had indeed been found. In 2020, Nat Friedman, the then CEO of GitHub, learned of the Herculaneum scrolls after he became interested in ancient Roman culture. Intrigued by the idea that the scrolls could be opened virtually and read, Friedman announced that a competition would be held to see who could read at least 4 continuous passages of the scrolls first. Whoever achieved this feat would be awarded $700,000, and in March of 2023, the competition was officially underway. News of the competition, known as the Vesuvius Challenge, reached the ears of an intern working for SpaceX, a man named Luke Ferreter, and he was immediately interested. He finished his shift for the day and immediately drove home to read more about the challenge and the strange scrolls that were leaving scholars baffled. He came across findings from another contestant who believed he'd found ink on one of the scrolls while looking at the scans that had been taken. This gave Farrader a good idea of what to look for, and as he closely scrutinized the rest of the scrolls, he found 10 more letters. Knowing that there was another $40,000 prize on offer to anyone who could find 10 legible letters in a 1.5-inch area of any of the scrolls, he set about finding a way to read more of the text using AI technology. It would eventually be announced that Farrader had won the $40,000 prize after the AI model found the word purple, and other contestants who'd been working on the same problem were quick to notice. One of these contestants was 26-year-old Yusef Nader, who was studying at university in Berlin. He had also been looking into AI technology to unravel the mysteries held by the scrolls, tweaking his model according to small fragments of text that had previously been found, and he was awarded a prize of $1,500 for his efforts. He then started looking at the same section of the scroll that Farrader had been working on, and after he found a few more letters, he added them to his AI model, which then revealed even more of the letters, which are currently being translated by experts. The grand prize is still up for grabs, but the prospects of it ever being won are quickly dwindling. The 2 scrolls that are being studied by contestants will likely not hold enough usable material to be read by the AI models, and since the competition closes at the end of 2023, there's virtually no chance of continuous passages of text being identified. But there is hope beyond the Vesuvius Challenge. As AI technology is improved over the coming years, something that's all but destined to happen, these models may be able to identify other areas on the scrolls that contain legible ink, and more of the ancient writings can then hopefully be deciphered. Both Farrader and Nader have stated that they plan to invest in more computers after winning money from the challenge, since they would like to see what other messages are hidden inside these scrolls that are around 2,000 years old. Farrader, for one, has stated that after he graduates from university, he would like to continue studying the scrolls, not only because of the prospect of winning the grand prize, but because he's extremely interested in what was written on the papyri and who it was written by. Though the texts may not hold any historically important information, they could still give us valuable insights into the daily lives of the people who lived in the area at that time that Vesuvius erupted. And if nothing else, it'll be very thrilling to read the writings of someone who lived 2,000 years ago. Researchers have now also realized that the virtual unwrapping technology used to find letters on the Herculaneum scrolls could be used on more modern texts that have until now been too damaged or fragile to read. One candidate for this process is the Franklin Papers, which were badly damaged and could contain notes on that famous Arctic expedition. For now, though, it remains a waiting game to see who will be the first to unravel more of the scroll's secrets, but the mystery is slowly unraveling and may finally be completely solved in the near future. Most of us are familiar with the famous novel Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley, in which a Swiss scientist named Victor Frankenstein creates a monster from the body parts of deceased people. When the monster doesn't live up to Frankenstein's expectations, he turns his back on it, causing the monster to go on a murderous rampage. The novel ends in tragedy when Frankenstein passes away and his monster vows to take his own life. It's a story that's been told for many, many years, and it's certain to be told for many more. But there are some details about its creation that have been disputed over the years, one of which focuses on Shelley's inspiration to write it. Shelley was just 18 years old when she wrote the novel in June of 1816, and at the time she was visiting Switzerland along with her husband Percy, her stepsister, Lord Byron, and a man named John Polidori. The setting around the villa was dark and gloomy, with several rain and thunderstorms moving through the area, likely caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora, which resulted in 1816 becoming known as the Year Without Summer. It seemed the perfect setting for a few ghost stories, and each member of the group took turns to read to each other from a collection of German ghost stories that had been translated into French. Lord Byron then came up with a neat idea and suggested that each of the guests write their own ghost story that would be just as enjoyable, if not more so, than the tales in the book that they were reading from. The stories were so vivid that Shelley still remembered most of their details more than a decade and a half later, with two of the stories in particular standing out, namely the history of the inconstant lover and the tale of the sinful founder of his race. But this is where the details get a little murky. Most scholars maintain that this challenge was set on the 16th of June, and that Shelley then produced her story the very next day. But according to Shelley, she struggled to come up with an idea for several days after the challenge had been set, leading many scholars to believe that her version of events is in fact untrue. Shelley claimed that after days of struggling to find inspiration for a story, she was up past midnight having a philosophical discussion with one of her fellow guests. When she'd had enough, she decided to go to bed, but she struggled with nightmares in which a male figure attempted to bring a corpse back to life with the use of his scientific knowledge. She woke from the dream with a start and saw that the moon was shining brightly into her window. She had found the inspiration she needed and immediately started writing her famous work, Frankenstein, later recounting the evening by writing, quote, "What terrified me will terrify others, and I need only describe the specter that had haunted my midnight pillow." According to a diary kept by Polidori, he was the one who hadn't started his story by morning after the challenge had been set, but according to Shelley, she hadn't started writing hers until days after, leaving scholars with a perplexing discrepancy. Some people believe she made her version of events up in hopes that her novel would sell more copies, and that she actually started writing the story immediately after going to her room that night. Unfortunately, Polidori doesn't mention the exact date that the challenge was set in his diary, and it had always just been assumed that this was done on the 16th of June, since his entry about not starting his story was dated the 17th. What is known is that the challenge was definitely set by Byron, and that he, along with Polidori, arrived at the villa on the 10th. This means that the challenge had to have been set between the 10th and the 16th. There are, however, further clues that help narrow the dates down. Since Shelley mentioned the moon shining in through her window on that night in June, researchers knew that they could rely on the position of the moon relative to the villa to pin down the exact dates. In August of 2010, a group of astronomers from Texas State University traveled to Villa Diodati, where they made notes about the villa's position, as well as the position of Shelley's window and the terrain surrounding the building. From here, they had the task of determining the position of the moon during the time that the four guests were staying at the villa. And to do this, they scoured through weather records for the entire month of June 1816. They found that the moon would have indeed been shining brightly during the early morning hours at the time, and it would have cleared a nearby hill just before 2 a.m. as it rose on the 16th of June. This would mean that Byron had likely suggested the challenge between the 10th and the 13th of June rather than the 16th, as was previously believed. It also proved that she had indeed stayed up past midnight on the 15th while she was involved in a philosophical discussion. If the challenge had been set on the 13th, it would mean that Shelley struggled for 3 days before she saw a beam of light shining through her window, and that she would have started the novel on the 16th. Donald Olson, a Texas State University faculty member, stated that he had always been curious about Shelley's claims, and that he'd always hoped to recreate the exact circumstances of that evening when Shelley was struck by inspiration to write one of the most famous horror novels in all of history. The team was aware that there was another version of events that took place inside the villa. Some people suggested that Byron actually set the challenge on the 16th, and that Shelley only started writing her story on the 22nd. But this would have been impossible, as it's now been discovered that there would not have been sufficient moonlight on that evening, and that Shelley would not have seen the moon shining in through her window on that particular date. And so it seems that the mystery surrounding Shelley's claims had finally been solved, and that she'd been telling the truth all along. It should be noted that she wasn't the only author to pen a famous story during the group's time at the villa. Although Polidori had been struggling to come up with his own story, as is evidenced by his diary entries, he would eventually also find inspiration and pen the famous short story The Vampire, resulting in the first ever tale in the English language that centered on a terrifying subject of vampires. Shelley's novel would become a roaring success when it was published 2 years later, and at first she was hesitant to come forward as its author, given the macabre subject matter that the story focused on. This led many people to believe that her husband, Percy, had actually written the story, but this theory has been disproven since Shelley's notes show that Percy merely served as an editor during its creation. Quite unbelievably, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein still sells as many as 40,000 copies every year, a remarkable feat given that it was written over 200 years ago. Egyptian history is steeped in mystery, and thanks to this, many people believe that archaeological sites found there have a special significance, particularly that some of the ancient structures in the country have some connection to the paranormal extraterrestrial beings of energies that only the ancient Egyptians knew how to use. There are also rumors that some of the tombs that have been found in Egypt contain mummies that will curse anyone who opens them, or that some of the relics found inside these tombs also hold terrible curses. This is, of course, the stuff of fiction, since no solid proof has ever been found that anyone working on these sites has ever been truly cursed in any way. Deaths that occurred after viewing or working on these items have been explained as having nothing to do with anything paranormal. And yet, these rumors persist today, as more artifacts are extracted from the ground, some of which have left researchers and archaeologists baffled. Some of these theories stem from a misunderstanding of the hieroglyphs that were used by ancient Egyptians, many of which are still being discovered at new dig sites today. And although they seem to depict one thing, they usually mean another. One such hieroglyph has kept people scratching their heads since it was discovered in the Temple of Seti, at the archaeological site of the ancient city of Abydos, which is situated on the west bank of the Nile River. The city is considered to be one of the most important Egyptian discoveries ever made. During its heyday, the city would have served as a cemetery during the First and Second dynasties, after which it served as an area where people could pray to the god Osiris, with people traveling from far and wide to do so. But in modern times, the site is best known for the hieroglyphs that have been discovered there, known as the Abydos carvings. Conspiracy theorists often refer to the carvings as the helicopter hieroglyphs, and at a glance it's easy to see why. On one set of hieroglyphs, it was noted that some of the characters resembled machinery from the modern era, specifically a helicopter, 2 planes, a submarine, and rather more outlandishly, an extraterrestrial craft. One well-known ufologist, Steve Mera, who serves as the chairman of Manchester's Association of Paranormal Investigation and Training, stated at a UFO conference held in London that the helicopter hieroglyph clearly depicts a machine with a rudder and a set of rotor blades, as would be found on a helicopter. He insists that these carvings were made after a visit from extraterrestrial beings, since he believes the ancient Egyptians couldn't possibly have carved these images without seeing these machines with their own eyes. Some people have speculated that these characters could be considered out-of-place artifacts that have no explanation, since the ancient Egyptians surely could not have had knowledge of these items. This has given rise to a whole slew of further conspiracy theories that include suggestions that the ancient Egyptians were visited by extraterrestrials, who either told them about these machines or demonstrated how they were to be used. It's also been suggested that these extraterrestrials had a hand in building the Great Pyramids and other notable structures, either by using unknown technology to move the massive stones used in their construction, or by providing the ancient Egyptians with that same technology that allowed them to move the stones themselves. Some people have even gone so far as to claim that these hieroglyphs don't actually exist, and that the photos depicting them have been faked, though it's uncertain why an archaeologist would choose to do this. Another theory that's been put forward is that the ancient Egyptians were visited by people from the future, and that these visitors brought the machinery seen in the hieroglyphs with them to aid in the construction of various sites around Egypt. Why a time traveler would choose to visit Egypt rather than any other area on Earth is unknown, which is unsurprising given that these theories often offer very little as far as solid and undeniable proof is concerned. But the true explanation for these characters is far more logical. It is well known that a newly appointed pharaoh would often have new hieroglyphs carved over those left behind by the previous pharaoh, and it's also known that this process took place at the Temple of Seti in Abydos, where the helicopter hieroglyphs were discovered. The section of the temple that contains these hieroglyphs was built during the reign of Seti I, but when Ramses II took over, He had his own set of hieroglyphs added over those left by Seti I. This resulted in the characters becoming distorted over time, and what is seen by modern humans as a helicopter, a plane, or a submarine was initially carved to depict something entirely different. But many people have refused to accept this explanation, since similar carvings have been discovered in the Amon-Ra temple in Karnak, which is situated near Luxor in Egypt. They claim that it would be virtually impossible for two separate palimpsests to result in the same images, and that the hieroglyphs clearly show modern machinery that should not have been around at that time. It's also been suggested that the images are a result of a mistake made by the person who carved them. One blogger speculates that one pharaoh's name had been carved into the stone erroneously, and the carver then tried to rectify his mistake by simply carving the correct name over the first. They suggest that as time passed and the images eroded, the result was an image that resembled a helicopter and other modern pieces of machinery. They go on to explain that what looks like a helicopter or a submarine to modern humans would have likely depicted something far more mundane to the people who carved them, such as a body part, an animal, or a notable event that had taken place. The fact that extraterrestrials, modern machinery, and the like aren't mentioned in any other ancient Egyptian writing all but debunks this outlandish theory that they were in any way involved in the lives of the people who created the puzzling hieroglyphs, or that they had a hand in creating these ancient buildings. When the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799, it made it possible for archaeologists and historians to decode thousands of the hieroglyphs found at these ancient sites, none of which made any mention of alien beings, time travelers, or machinery from the future. Since the ancient Egyptians prided themselves on keeping records of every notable event, it seems highly unlikely that they would have been chosen to omit an event such as being visited by a race from another planet, or receiving help from someone who could travel through time. The mystery has now finally been solved, and although we don't know exactly what these hieroglyphs are meant to depict, we can rest easy with the knowledge that they have nothing to do with modern machinery, time travel, or aliens from beyond the stars. Metal detecting is a hobby practiced by hundreds of thousands of people all over the world, some of whom take it very seriously as they hunt for the treasures that have been lost or left behind by others. 48-year-old Buffy Bailey, a National Health Service nurse from Lancashire in England, is one such enthusiast, along with her husband, 59-year-old Ian. The couple is in the habit of traveling all around the country with their metal detectors, and in 2021, they decided to visit York while on vacation. Buffy says they chose this area because it has a lot of history, making it more likely that they could stumble upon an artifact or something of interest to historians. They've made reservations to stay at a farm in the area, and as soon as they arrived, the owner asked whether they would like to go out detecting. The couple was more than ready and headed out immediately, doing their best to avoid fellow vacationers in the area, since they've been known to interrupt their detecting sessions with silly questions about what they managed to find so far. Buffy was walking along a footpath when her metal detector suddenly indicated that there was something beneath the soil. She didn't expect to find anything out of the ordinary, given that they were on a farm, and there were likely many pieces of metal that had been covered by dirt over time. She assumed that when she dug down to find them, it would likely be an ear tag that had been lost by a sheep, or something even more common, like a pull tab from a can of beer or soda. Nevertheless, she dug down about 5 inches to see what she could find, and to her surprise, it was something she'd never seen before, but she still didn't think it would be anything special. She then proceeded to remove as much of the dirt from the object as she could, and that's when she realized this was no ordinary find. It looked like a small book, and at first she assumed it must have fallen off of someone's charm bracelet, but it seemed heavier than a normal charm. She then used her phone to take a photo of the small book, and when she zoomed in on this image, she realized that it was made of gold. She called Ian, who was searching in an adjacent field, to come and fetch her because she was so shocked at the discovery that she found herself frozen in place. But it would be another hour before he did so. Realizing that the small book would be historically significant, the couple took it to the Richard III Society, and it's currently being held by the Yorkshire Museum, where it's being studied by historians after it was found to be internationally important. It's since attracted the attention of historians from around the world, who have stated that the two figures engraved on the book's open pages are without a doubt St. Leonard and St. Margaret, the patron saints of childbirth. It's thought that the book would have been owned by someone during the 1400s, and that they likely carried it with them as a form of protection during pregnancy. This is all the more likely given the fact that between 40 and 60% of women didn't survive childbirth during that period. It's also been suggested that the tiny book may have originally been part of a birthing girdle, or that it may simply be a bookmark used by people to keep their place while reading the Bible. Historians are very excited about the discovery, since nothing like it has ever been found. It's believed that the owner of the book must have been very well off, since it's made of gold and would have been specially commissioned. It's been estimated to be worth as much as £100,000, or 125 US dollars. One expert named Julian Evan Hart has dated the book to between 1280 and 1410. Given that it was illegal for anyone except members of royalty to carry gold at that time, it seems likely that the book's owner was very important indeed. It's also been suggested that it was created by the same craftsperson that made the Middleham jewel, which was also discovered by a metal detector enthusiast in 1985, since the two objects have remarkably similar engravings, though the latter contains imagery of Jesus' crucifixion, the Nativity, and the 15 saints. The jewel was also believed to protect its wearer, and it would enhance their prayers against physical ailments that included ulcers, headaches, stammers, and failing eyesight. This item would have belonged to someone of the upper classes, since similar items are often seen in depictions of late 15th century noblewomen, usually worn on necklaces. It's also been suggested that the Middleham jewel protected its wearer against difficult childbirth, as is the case with Buffy's book. There is a very real possibility that these treasures were lost by their wearers and that this would have been a very tragic event for them. But some scholars suggest that they may have been buried in these areas on purpose, either because a child was born without any complications or the opposite, that the grief of losing a child during labor would have been too much to bear. It's also possible that the book belonged to someone of a lower class, who then buried it as a precautionary measure, since they would have gotten into a lot of trouble if they were caught carrying an item made of gold, or depicting religious imagery during the English Reformation. Some scholars have even suggested that the book and the Middleham jewel were owned by the same person, and that they hid the items in order to retrieve them for later, but for some unknown reason were unable to do so. After its discovery, some people thought that the book was meant to be a representation of the Bible, but this is very unlikely, since it was tradition to have the words "in the beginning" engraved onto any piece of jewelry or art that had anything to do with the Bible. What needs to be done next is to attempt to identify the person that the tiny book belonged to, which is a formidable task in itself. Whether or not this will be possible remains to be seen, since the piece is beyond rare, and it'll be very difficult to trace its origins. Once the book has been thoroughly studied by historians at the Yorkshire Museum, it can either be purchased by the museum or returned to Buffy. Any monetary gains from the sale of the book will be divided up between Buffy and the owner of the farm where it was unearthed. It's a very unlikely discovery that is not likely to be repeated anytime soon, but it's one that'll keep historians busy for some time to come. The Dreyfus Affair was a scandal that impacted France in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It involved a French army artillery captain named Alfred Dreyfus, who was incorrectly accused of providing the German military with intel. It had been in 1894 when a French spy who was at the German embassy had found a ripped-up letter in a wastebasket. The letter, after being reassembled, was said to be the handwriting of Dreyfus. He became the main focus for a few reasons, one of which was because he was in the artillery, which is what the secrets had allegedly been about. And secondly, he was an officer who would have access to the information as discussed in the letter. After some investigation, even though there'd been a lack of evidence, Dreyfus was court-martialed. During a trial, the captain was found guilty of treason with a sentence of life behind bars. The sentence was to be carried out on Devil's Island, situated off the coast of French Guiana. In a heartbreaking ceremony, the convicted man had his insignia ripped off of his uniform and his sword was broken. His family maintained that he was innocent, but nothing about the incident changed until George Picard was appointed as head of the information service the following year. He'd found evidence that pointed to the real culprit, who was a French military officer, Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. When Picard had revealed this information to the Major's bosses, he was told to discontinue the investigation and was thereafter transferred to North Africa and imprisoned. Esterhazy's superiors tried to cover up his involvement in the transferring of secrets, but news that he was possibly guilty began to circulate. A new trial was held with a large press coverage and media that was fueled by new publications. One such publication was the work of Émile Zola in the newspaper L'Orha. It was an open letter in support of Dreyfus that was directed to President Félix Faure. The letter condemned the judicial error as well as those responsible for it. He'd further accused the military of an incredible cover-up case on their mistaken conviction. Of course, this publication faced backlash and he was convicted of libel. Zola was lucky enough to escape to England and would later return to France. Dreyfus, on the other hand, was again convicted of a crime that he had not committed. This time, he was sentenced to 10 years, but was later given amnesty by the French government. Dreyfus's sentence was annulled, and by 1906, he was reinstated in the army. This cover-up affair had divided the national opinion, while questioning the morals of the Republic. France had been split into two opposing camps throughout this scandal. On the one side, there were the anti-Dreyfusards, who'd been against the reopening of the case. The other side had been the Dreyfusards who were seeking exoneration for the captain. This divide had left a deep wound in France that has since not fully healed. This cover-up was one of oil tycoons, gambling politicians, and a bag full of bribes that were delivered ever so slyly. It was the Teapot Dome scandal that shocked Americans in the 1920s, when it was revealed that there was an unmatched level of corruption present within the federal government. This had been the first time that a United States cabinet official had been incarcerated for a felony that was committed during their office time. This scandal came before Watergate and was regarded as one of the most astounding examples of corruption at such a high level of U.S. politics. Right in the center of it all was the secretary of Warren G. Harding, who occupied the White House at the time. It was Albert Fall behind it all, who accepted bribes from oil companies in exchange for drilling for oil on federal land. One of the sites was near a teapot-shaped rock formation in Wyoming called the Teapot Dome. A dome is a geological formation that keeps oil underground between rock layers. The upper layer is bent upward, forming a dome. Harding had appointed Fall, who was his friend and the first senator of New Mexico, as the Secretary of Interior. Within a matter of weeks, he was able to convince the president to allow a transfer of the Naval Petroleum Reserves, and argued that the Interior was better equipped to oversee the protection of the areas, where oil was not supposed to be produced from, and was kept in case of an absolute emergency. Once the oil field was under his control, Fall would go on to make secret deals with two oilmen and close friends of the secretary, Edward Doheny and Harry Sinclair. In 1922, with no public announcement, the secretary had leased drilling rights to the whole Teapot Dome site to the Mammoth Oil Company that was owned by Sinclair. There were two other sites that came under Fall's control. They were both based in California, named Elk Hills and Buena Vista Hills. This site would be leased to the Pan American Petroleum Company, owned by Doheny. Back in Wyoming, though, the Democratic government, Leslie Miller, grew suspicious upon seeing the arrival of trucks with the Sinclair Company logo, hauling equipment into the Teapot Dome Reserve. He confided in U.S. Senator John B. Kendrick, asking him to look into the matter. The senator sensed some wrongdoing and would turn the matter over to an investigating committee. When the affair was under investigation, Congress had directed the president to cancel the leases as they were declared fraudulent. His transfer of authority to Fall had also been deemed illegal. Harding was not implicated in the transactions following authority transfer, but the betrayal that his associated cast upon him had taken a toll on his health. At this time, Harding had gone west for the summer and stopped in Wyoming, where he enjoyed Yellowstone before heading to Alaska and then San Francisco, where he would suddenly pass away as the scandal was unfolding. A rather long Senate investigation ensued, and Fall would be tried for accepting bribes. Following his conviction, he would be sent to federal prison, marking the first cabinet-level officer in history to be imprisoned for crimes that were committed during their service in office. Sinclair and Doheny were not exonerated for giving bribes to the secretary. One newspaper reported that you cannot convict $1 million, which pointed to the two oilmen being quite wealthy. They were found not guilty. Sinclair, however, served a 9-month sentence for contempt of Congress, as well as faced charges for his connection in hiring detectives to trial jury members during the initial bribery trial. The federal government had brought in a suit to cancel the bribery-induced leases on the Teapot Dome. The U.S. District Judge Blake Kennedy had pushed back against the government on this front, but the leases were eventually canceled due to the U.S. Supreme Court overturning Kennedy's decision. The News of the World newspaper company was exposed in a phone hacking scandal. It was revealed by Nick Davies and Amelia Hill that this newspaper was responsible for illegally accessing a recently deceased's voicemails. Rupert Murdoch, the owner of the said newspaper, concluded that his tabloid had become toxic and quickly shut it down, firing most of his staff, which consisted of 200 people. It was discovered that employees of this company had engaged in phone hacking, as well as bribery, which included that of police officers. It was after this exposure that those on Fleet Street had either chosen to look or to look away from what was being revealed. Fleet Street refers to a street in central London that's known for printing and publishing. The phone hacking scandal had surfaced after a royal editor named Clive Goodman, along with a private investigator named Glenn Mulcair, had been arrested for a story about Prince William. They were jailed for conspiracy to intercept phone messages. The allegations were reported in the newspaper, followed by a series of claims stating that the journalists of the News of the World were hacking phones. Mulcair was given a phone number in order to acquire its voicemails, and was to report back to the news desk. He had also kept a detailed note as to who the target was and who had hired him. Allegations continued to be made regarding this newspaper and its spying technique. These reports inevitably led to a new investigation by Scotland Yard. This investigation led to the discovery of the hacked voicemails. It was found that the imprisoned Mulcair was given 2,246 investigative tasks by reporters for the newspaper. Police investigations found evidence of 690 audio recordings in the first 2006 police raid. It was later believed that almost 6,000 people could have been victims of this illegal phone hacking scandal. Inquiries of wrongdoing were being conducted from 2005, revealing that celebrities, politicians, and the British royal family had all been subjected to this form of spying. After the tabloid had published a story on Prince William's injury treatment, it was found that they'd gathered such information by tapping into his phone and listening to his voicemails. The allegations against the newspaper journalists had led to the closure of News of the World in 2011. One of the newspaper's editors, Andy Coulson, would be found guilty of conspiracy to hack phones during a lengthy trial. During the trial, it was disclosed that out-of-court settlements had prevented further allegations from being aired. A few of the newspaper stories were found to have gotten their information directly from those involved in this scandalous way. Han van Meegeren was a Dutch painter who's most well known for his successful forging scheme and selling paintings that were attributed to Dutch masters. He was able to fool both the buyers and the experts, which inevitably led to a trial for treason. He was particularly talented in forging the works of one of the most famous artists in history, Vermeer. This artist had a meticulous style and used fine pigments to produce realistic paintings that play with light, focus, and reflection. He generally painted the interior scenes with people going about their everyday routines. Due to the precision that he used, many believe that Vermeer had made use of mirrors and other precursors, where others believe he worked from pure talent alone. Meegeren was a mid-level artist on the other hand. He'd studied art and would start a career as an art teacher. He would later attempt to provide for his family by selling his paintings, but his abilities were viewed as decent or adequate. He too favored realism and rejected modern and abstract art movements that were popular at the time. It proved difficult to sell unpopular art. Additionally, his art lacked originality, although he displayed a technical talent. These negative reviews ultimately led to the scandal. It was soon realized that his true talent was forgery. Meegeren's process of producing such paintings was long and complex. It would take him just a few years to perfect the technique, with determination to pass a forgery off as the works of Vermeer. He perfected the skill of drying the artwork in the oven to create just the right amount of cracks, and used self-made paintbrushes of badger hide. In 1937, an art historian named Abraham Bradius was approached by a lawyer who was a trustee of a Dutch family estate. He asked the historian to take a look at a painting of Christ and the disciples of Emmaus. Not long after viewing the painting, Bradius declared its authenticity and to be the work of the great Vermeer. The expert was fooled, however, as this was the work of a forgery. Doubts were cast by the historian's colleagues, as his opinion was viewed as the gospel of the art world, in which he'd been nicknamed the Pope. The forger had made a mistake that would expose his fake career, though. It was found that he'd sold what was thought to be an authentic Vermeer painting to Field Marshal Hermann Goering during the Second World War. This was seen as collaborating with the enemy, which had a rather terrible punishment. In an unlikely form of defense, the forger would come to state that the National Treasure artwork was not that at all. The piece, called Christ with the Woman Taken in Adultery, was revealed to be a forgery by Migren himself, an strange twist of events which was done to evade prosecution. The forger had viewed himself as a hero, since the painting was traded for 200 original Dutch paintings that Goering had seized at the start of the war. He would also later admit to painting 5 other Vermeers and 2 Pieter de Hoogh's, which had appeared in the art market from 1937. The trial of Han van Meegeren started on the 29th of October in 1947, in the 4th room of the regional court in Amsterdam. In an effort to prove he'd forged the artwork, the artist would have to demonstrate this under police guard before the trial. He had to paint another Vermeer piece titled Jesus Among the Doctors. He used the same techniques and materials that he had employed for the other forgery works, in which case he was found not guilty of collaboration with the enemy. Instead, Migren would face charges of forgery and be condemned to 1 year of incarceration. He would later state that he'd produced these forgeries not for money, but rather for the sake of art. The Volkswagen emissions scandal is known as Dieselgate or Emissionsgate. It refers to a controversy that surrounds the use of illegal software in some diesel vehicles that were manufactured by Volkswagen. This software allowed the vehicles to emit more harmful pollutants than allowed. The scandal came to light in 2015 and had consequences for the company, shareholders, and the automotive industry. It all started when the United States Environmental Protection Agency found that these VW diesel vehicles were letting off higher levels of nitrogen oxide than was legally allowed by law. Nitrogen oxide, a smog pollutant linked to lung cancer, contributes greatly to air pollution and is known to have negative impacts on the health of citizens. Through further investigation, it was found that the software was known as a defeat device. This device would activate emission controls when the cars were being tested, but during driving conditions, the emission controls would be turned off, subsequently allowing for higher levels of nitrogen oxide to be released. It was able to detect steering, throttle, and other inputs that were being used in the test to switch between the 2 operating modes. During test mode, the cars are compliant with the emission levels allowed by law, but during the drive, the computer will switch to a different mode, which changes the fuel pressure, injection timing, and exhaust gas recirculation. The EPA and California Air Resources Board officials wanted to know why real-time emissions conducted on open road tests were 35 times more than when those same cars were tested in a facility. It was determined that the illegal software was installed on more than 600,000 VW diesel cars in the United States alone, and millions more across the globe. Initially, the company denied any wrongdoing, but would later admit to using the illegal software, and would thereafter pay billions of dollars in fines and settlements. The attempted cover-up of the over-the-limit emissions would result in significant financial repercussions. They were due to pay billions to the EPA, as well as the other regulatory agencies, and had the addition of compensation for their customers. They later went on to face various lawsuits from shareholders, who stated that the actions of the vehicle company damaged the value of their investments. Volkswagen also had reputational impacts, as they had prided themselves on their environmental responsibility. They'd misled their customers and the regulators about the impact that their vehicles had on the environment. The scandal has since had lasting effects on both the company's sales as well as market share. 500,000 diesel Volkswagen vehicle models were cited for violations. It was not only Volkswagen either. Both Audi and Porsche diesel models were also cited for emission violations. There's no recall for these vehicles, and it's neither a state nor a safety issue, as it was a federal law that was violated. The Volkswagen diesel vehicles that were cited by the EPA are the 2009 to 2015 Volkswagen Jetta with a 2-liter TDI engine, the 2010 to 2015 Golf with the 2-liter TDI engine, the 2012 to 2015 Beetle with a 2-liter TDI, 2012 to 2015 Passat with a 2-liter TDI, and the 2009 to 2016 Volkswagen Touareg 3.0 V6 TDI engine. In 2019, German prosecutors had raided a Volkswagen branch in Wolfsburg as part of a fresh investigation into Dieselgate. The interest was on the EA288 4-cylinder engine, which is the successor of the EA189, around which the initial investigation had centered. Volkswagen had stated that the new engine was not equipped with the defeat device. Just over 50 years ago, the Pentagon Papers had shocked America. These papers were found to contain the history of the United States' role in Indochina from the Second World War up until May of 1968. They were commissioned the previous year by the United States Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. The papers would then be turned over to the New York Times without any authorization by a senior research associate, Daniel Ellsberg, of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Center for International Studies. Ellsberg was the analyst for Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, who produced a classified study on the Vietnam War. In its entirety of 47 volumes, there were around 3,000 pages of narrative and 4,000 pages of documents, which took over 18 months for Ellsberg to complete. He'd initially been a supporter of the United States' role in Indochina, but by the end of the lengthy project, he would change his position and opposed their involvement completely. After the conclusion was reached, he felt compelled to show the nature of the participation of the U.S., and thereafter leaked a major portion of the papers to the media. In June of 1971, the New York Times started to publish articles that were based on the study, which had been classified as top secret by the government. A temporary restraining order was obtained against any further publications of this classified material. But just because the paper couldn't, didn't mean that the others were prohibited as well. The Post was next in line, and when they were no longer allowed to publish, other newspapers would do it. While the government had tried to prevent the Pentagon Papers from being published, it was too late. The role of the U.S. in the war was revealed. What they'd tried to hide was the fact that Harry S. Truman's administration had given military aid to France during the colonial war against the communist Viet Minh, which had directly involved the country in Vietnam. They had also tried to prevent anyone from knowing that in 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower prevented a communist takeover of South Vietnam and undermined the new communist regime of North Vietnam. It was further found that President John F. Kennedy had changed the limited risk gamble policy that he inherited into a broad commitment policy. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson had escalated covert warfare against Vietnam and started planning to wage overt war, which came 1 year before the public reveal of the depth of the United States' involvement within Vietnam. Johnson also ordered an attack on Vietnam in 1965, in defiance of the judgment of the United States' intelligence community that would not cause the Vietnamese to stop their support of the Viet Cong insurgency. The release of these facts to the public stirred international controversy, as it had occurred after a few years of growing disagreement over legal as well as moral justification for intensifying United States' actions within Vietnam. These revelations had been so distressing to President Nixon's re-election that he'd authorized unlawful efforts to discredit Ellsberg. Such efforts had included a burglary at the Beverly Hills office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist. This was an attempt to unearth some embarrassing information masterminded by E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA operative. These unlawful efforts would come to light during the investigation into the Watergate scandal. Alfred Redl was a leading figure in pre-World War I espionage. He was an Austrian officer who became the head of the counterintelligence efforts in Austria-Hungary. He'd made use of high technology to ensure foreign intelligence agents, but was a spy for the Russians. Some rumors claimed he worked for the secret services of France and Italy, but this was never reliably confirmed nor disproven. During his occupancy within the counter-espionage service, he'd improved the methods they used. At the same time, he was employed by Russia, Austria's enemy. His exposure was also made largely due to the improvements that he developed. Rettel's motives for the espionage were never clarified, but it's been suggested that he was caught in a compromising position by the Russian officials that would have possibly been used against him. It's been stated that military intelligence based in Warsaw, under the command of Colonel Nikolai Batyushin, found out a secret that the officer was keeping and had used it as blackmail. He'd been paid well for such a service and lived a lifestyle well above what his actual salary could cover. Blackmail was not an unusual act at the time, and payment would ensure that the information kept coming. From 1903 up until 1913, Rettel was the leading spy for Russia. Before the war, he would give the enemy Plan 3, which was the Austrian invasion plan for Serbia. They would go on to tell the Serbian military of the plan, and when Austria set out to invade them, the Serbians were ready. Rettel had given away all of Austria's military plans and secrets, along with an incorrect estimation of Russia's military strength to the Austrian military. He became directly responsible for 500,000 fatalities of his own countrymen. Upon leaving the counterintelligence service, Major Maximilian Range had taken his place. Range had been trained by Rettel, and he had instigated the practice of looking into suspicious mail. One of these mails was a letter that was to be returned unclaimed. It was discovered that it contained a large sum of money and references to espionage cover addresses. The same letter was posted again, along with the money, to the same name, Nikon Nizitas. Detectives were sent to monitor the post and were instructed to follow whoever claimed it. When it was finally claimed, the suspect was pursued, but they soon lost contact when he entered a taxi. Fortunately, as the officers were thinking about what to do next, the taxi returned. They approached the driver and asked him to take them to the same location that the previous client was taken to. It was Hotel Klomser that the previous man had been dropped off at. While in the taxi, the detectives had found a sheath, so they asked the hotel management to check with any of the guests if they had lost one. One guest arrived to claim the sheath as theirs, and to the detectives' astonishment, it was their former boss, Colonel Alfred Rettel. Another discovery was made in 1914, when it was found that military secrets had landed in the hands of a civilian because the Evidence Bureau had failed to correctly screen the camera belonging to the spy, which he'd sold to clear some debt. He was portrayed as one of the most notorious traitors of the 20th century. Up until recently, the facts of this case had been difficult to determine or verify. Records had been conveniently lost, hidden, or destroyed, and those who knew Rettel were reluctant to speak the truth. Austrian authorities were also said to have attempted to cover up this disaster. Historians have also been content to bring the case back to light. Over the past decade, Russian archives have also been reopened. These surviving case files are also available to researchers and reveal the Russian side of the story that's never been told. Northwoods refers to a false flag operation that began inside the United States Department of Defense in 1962. The plan was to provoke war with Havana, and in the process, take out a Soviet ally, Fidel Castro. The idea was to establish chaos within the United States cities, with the belief that it would drum up support for a war carried out against Cuba. The operation had included the plot of targeting an empty U.S. ship that stood in Guantanamo Bay, and thereafter blamed it on Havana. A Pentagon memo stated, quote, "Sabotage ship in harbor, large fires," and "sink ship near harbor entrance, conduct funerals for mock victims." It was alleged that the plans had written approval from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they were presented to the Defense Secretary of President John F. Kennedy, Robert McNamara, in March of 1962, but were subsequently denied by the civilian leadership and went undisclosed for almost 40 years. The documentation of Operation Northwoods was declassified in 1992 and released for public use. The statement "Top Secret Special Handling" on each page was crossed out, and "Unclassified" was printed large and bold. The now declassified pages revealed that America's topmost military leaders had crafted a plan to commit acts of anarchism in the cities. Aside from sinking a ship, the operation entailed a possible assassination of Cuban immigrants, sinking boats with Cuban refugees, and hijacking planes. The plans were to be carried out in such a way that they tricked the American public into supporting an attack on Castro. Details of the alleged plan have been described in a book by an investigative reporter, James Bamford, called Body of Secrets. He further stated that the documents were that of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the reason they were kept a secret for so long is because the chiefs did not want to give them up as they were embarrassing. Bamford had further written that these papers showed that the chiefs of staff not only drew up but also approved the plans for the most corrupt plan ever to be made by the United States government. On one page of the documents, the problem was presented, which included a sentence explaining that the chief of staff was to present a detailed and precise description of what's considered to be the justification for military intervention in Cuba. It was recognized that the action would lead to a political decision that would thereafter begin the military action. It had also been recommended that the documents should be forwarded to the Secretary of Defense for approval, but not to the U.S. officers who were assigned to NATO activities, nor to the chairman, U.S. delegation, or the United Nations Military Staff Committee. Labeled as Enclosure A at point number 3, the plan was stated. It was written that the plan was to enable a buildup of incidents that were combined with what appeared to be unrelated events, in order to camouflage the objective and create an impression of Cuba's rashness directed at U.S. countries. The desired result, as stated in these official documents, had been to place the U.S. in the position of suffering defensible grievances that were acted upon by the government of Cuba, and to develop an international image of a Cuban threat. After the project was authorized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it was rejected by President Kennedy. While Operation Northwoods did not take place thereafter, it still caused an immense amount of distrust within the U.S. government, and many American lives would have been lost as a result if it were to be implicated. PRISM was the code name for a United States National Security Agency program. This program collects internet communications from internet companies. Back in 2013, the Washington Post published a horrifying discovery. 9 giants of the tech industry had partaken in this program, as so conducted by the NSA. A day later, the newspaper had revised the story and started backstepping its initial claims, but it was too late. The damage was done. The Post had been trying to catch up with The Guardian, who'd already broken the story, stating details of an alleged top-secret court order that asked Verizon to give them records disclosing the call data of millions of their customers. Not long after that publication, another declassified document made its way into the media, outlining the U.S. Presidential Policy Directive to create a hit list for alleged cyber attacks. Initially, the Post had outlined that the technology companies had knowingly participated in PRISM operations, but the edited version stated that the technology companies' cooperation was essential to the operation. According to a top-secret document, the NSA was able to obtain access to the systems of Facebook, Apple, Google, and other large internet corporations. The PRISM program allowed officials to collect material from search histories, email content, file transfers, and even live chats. A 41-slide PowerPoint presentation revealed that this was a project used to train intelligence operatives on the capabilities of the program. The documents additionally stated that the collections came directly from the servers of various United States providers. The presentation had claimed that PRISM was run with the help of these companies, but those who responded to a request set forth by The Guardian denied knowledge of such a program. Google had also stated that they care about user security and were disclosing data in accordance with the law. They denied having a back door present in their systems. Some senior tech executives also stated that they knew nothing of the PRISM program or any scheme similar to that, and said they would never participate in such a program. An Apple spokesman had also never heard of this operation. It would later be found that the NSA's access to this data was enabled by U.S. surveillance law changes that had been introduced under President Bush, and these laws were renewed later on in 2021. A private contractor who was working for Booz Allen Hamilton had leaked the aforementioned presentation slides, which had detailed the operation's existence and allowed the government to collect data from various companies. A lot of this program, as well as the NSA's surveillance efforts, are mostly a mystery, but more details began to surface due to public pressure, as well as its advocates and representatives. Pressure was placed on the government to come clean about their spying operation. The companies and the government have insisted that the collected data is done with court approval for very specific targets. The Washington Post claimed that the program has more than 100,000 records referring to active surveillance targets. News slides at the time had also come to suggest real-time monitoring of emails and text messages. Edward Snowden had been the one to leak the information, and was formerly employed not only by Hamilton, but also by the NSA and CIA. He said that he does not want to live in a society that does things like this. Snowden furthered that it was his civic duty to leak this highly classified information. He also informed the public that the collection of the data was a lot greater than what the public was being told. It was not only United States citizens who were subjected to data mining. This was a scandal that was carried out on a global scale. PRISM was able to obtain communications from Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Paltalk, AOL, Skype, YouTube, Apple, and unsurprisingly, Facebook. The leaked documents had also disclosed that the NSA tracks hundreds of millions of people's movements with the use of cell phone metadata. The reports of this operation had been published in 2013, but it had been running since 2008. It was also found that PRISM facilitates in-depth surveillance of live communications, as well as stored data. It opens the possibility of communication made within the United States to be collected without warrants. This program no longer exists in the way in which it was initially revealed. The data dragnets were found to be too unmanageable for the NSA's needs. Security agencies today are more likely to subpoena private data from the tech companies on a subject-by-subject basis. Snowden also revealed to the public that the companies in question were threatened with complying with the NSA, and they were only supposed to target those who were not an American citizen. Furthermore, the NSA was able to wiretap anyone within 3 degrees of a target. Western European nations have been caught in the PRISM net. X-Keyscore was a search engine that allowed analysts to dig through data that was obtained through PRISM. Tempora was another surveillance program that was being operated by GCHQ in the UK that harvests data from fiber optics cables, which the agency had been using. If it was not for Snowden, no one would have known that this level of data harvesting and spying was even taking place. Unit 731 refers to some of the most notorious war crimes that were committed by Japanese armed forces. In 2018, it was revealed that Japan had disclosed some names of members who were part of the unit that had conducted lethal experiments on citizens of China during the 1930s and 40s. These experiments have been conducted for the purpose of developing chemical and biological weaponry. In the late 1990s, Japan had reluctantly acknowledged that this unit existed, but had refused to discuss the activities that had gone on there. The horrors that had taken place here had all been rumors up until the passing of the Freedom of Information Act. A book was made of such atrocities that was titled Unit 731 Cover-Up, the Operation Paperclip of the East. These were the war crimes that had taken place following the Second World War. Most of the documentation of the crimes that had taken place were either destroyed or placed into the archives. It had been with the Freedom of Information Act that some documents could be retrieved from the United States National Archives and Records Administration. There had also been some that were sitting in Russian archives that related to this cover-up. Imperial Japan had sought to develop weapons of warfare that were prohibited after the First World War. Most of the citizens who were involved lived peacefully following the war, while others went through the Khabarovsk trial. The creation of Unit 731 and its partner Unit 100 were led and organized by Ishii Shiro. In 1945, the Soviet Union declared war upon Japan, and the Red Army moved into Manchuria. The Japanese government ordered that all research data be destroyed to erase the incriminating evidence. Shiro had fled to Tokyo, where he destroyed more documents of biological warfare testing and information. He also falsified his passing and paid mourners as well as reporters for a newspaper to announce his funeral. Before he fled, he forbade the researchers from discussing the work, but the real twist came in shortly after the war had ended, according to the archived documents. The United States was facing the dilemma of whether they should prosecute those responsible for the war crimes or bribe them for information. It was the second opinion that prevailed. The U.S. authorities offered the researchers immunity for the exchange of information. Former Unit 731 officials had gone on to have successful careers in medicine or other businesses. The U.S. government kept this information from the public after Shiro had already tried to cover his tracks and was able to live peacefully without any repercussions for what he had done to the prisoners. No one had suffered any consequences for what had happened in both Unit 731 and Unit 100, even though these places conducted the most violent war crimes known. The original Project Paperclip was a US program that sponsored the post-World War II immigration of Austrian as well as German scientists and technicians to the US to exploit their knowledge for military purposes. Hence why Unit 731 is compared with it. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.